What would you do if you walked into a place you owned, only to be accused of stealing from it? Imagine the shock, the humiliation, and the anger. Now, imagine if this happened because of the color of your skin. This is not just a story about injustice. It's a story about power, pride, and the fight against racism. So, grab a seat, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel because this is a story you won't want to miss. The lobby of the luxurious Grand Horizon Hotel was buzzing with activity. Guests in sleek suits and elegant dresses moved about, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The chandeliers sparkled, and the marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting. It was a place of opulence, a sanctuary for the wealthy and powerful. But today, something was about to shatter that perfect image. A woman walked in, her presence commanding yet calm. She was tall, with dark skin that seemed to glow under the lights. Her hair was styled in neat braids, and she wore a simple yet elegant pantsuit. She carried herself with confidence, her eyes scanning the room as if she owned it. And she did. Her name was Michelle Carter, and she was the owner of the Grand Horizon Hotel. But today, she wasn't here as the owner. She was here to observe, to see how her staff handled things when they didn't know who she was. Michelle had always believed in leading from the shadows. She had inherited the hotel from her father, who had built it from the ground up. But she wanted to make sure it was running smoothly, so she often visited incognito. Today, she had decided to dress down a bit, blending in with the guests. She had even left her usual entourage behind. It was just her, a notebook and a pen. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed a few staff members glancing at her. She didn't think much of it at first, but then she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to see a security guard, a tall man with a stern expression. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. "Can you come with me, please?" Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" The guard hesitated for a moment, then said, "We've received a report that you may have taken something that doesn't belong to you." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I'm sorry, what?" The guard's expression didn't change. "Please, just come with me." Michelle's mind raced. She knew she hadn't taken anything, but she also knew what this looked like. She was a black woman in a luxury hotel, and she was being accused of theft. The irony was almost too much to bear. She owned this place, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "All right," she said. "Let's get this over with." The guard led her to a small office near the back of the lobby. Inside, a manager was waiting. He was a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a nervous demeanor. He looked up as Michelle entered, his eyes widening slightly. "This is her?" he asked the guard. The guard nodded. "Yes, sir." The manager turned to Michelle, his expression a mix of suspicion and discomfort. "Ma'am, we've had a report that you may have taken a valuable item from one of our guests. We need to search your belongings." Michelle's jaw tightened. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I haven't taken anything," she said, her voice steady. "But go ahead. Search me." The manager hesitated, then nodded to the guard. The guard stepped forward, his hands outstretched. Michelle handed him her bag, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as he opened it, pulling out her notebook, her pen, her phone, and a few other personal items. There was nothing else in the bag. The guard looked up at the manager, shaking his head. "Nothing here, sir." The manager's face turned red. He looked at Michelle, his expression a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "It seems there's been a mistake." Michelle's eyes narrowed. "A mistake?" she repeated. "You accused me of theft based on what? A report? Who reported me?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "We received an anonymous tip," he said. "We had to follow protocol." Michelle shook her head, her anger boiling over. "Protocol? Is it protocol to accuse someone of theft without any evidence? Is it protocol to humiliate someone in front of everyone?" The manager didn't respond. He just stood there, looking down at his feet. Michelle took a step forward, her voice low but firm. "Do you know who I am?" The manager looked up, his eyes wide. I don't think so." Michelle reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. She handed it to the manager, her eyes never leaving his. Take a look. The manager took the card, his hands trembling slightly. He read it, his face turning pale. The card identified Michelle as the owner of the Grand Horizon Hotel. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Miss Carter. I had no idea." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "You didn't know," she said. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know, and yet you assumed. You assumed I was a thief because of the way I look, because of the color of my skin." The manager didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mask of shame. Michelle turned to the guard. "And you," she said, "do you always treat guests like this?" The guard looked down, his face red. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm sorry." Michelle shook her head. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about how you treat people, how you treat black people. This is unacceptable." She turned to leave, but then she stopped. She looked back at the manager, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she said. "You'll be hearing from me." And with that, she walked out of the office, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew this was just the beginning. She had a lot of work to do, and she wasn't going to stop until she made sure this never happened again. But as she walked through the lobby, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had been humiliated, accused of something she didn't do, and all because of the color of her skin. It was a harsh reminder of the world she lived in, a world where racism still existed, even in the places she thought were safe. As she reached the doors, she took one last look at the hotel. It was her hotel, her legacy. But today, it felt like a stranger. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know where to start. And then, just as she was about to leave, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Carter?" She turned around to see a young woman, one of the hotel staff, running towards her. The woman looked nervous, but there was something in her eyes that caught Michelle's attention. "Yes?" Michelle asked. The woman hesitated, then said, "I saw what happened. And I think you should know something." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" The woman looked around, making sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in and whispered, "It wasn't an anonymous tip. Someone set you up." Michelle's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" The woman looked nervous, but she continued. "I overheard a conversation. Someone wanted to embarrass you. They knew who you were." Michelle's mind raced. Who would do something like this? And why? Before she could ask any more questions, the woman turned and hurried away, leaving Michelle standing there, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about racism. This was personal. Someone had targeted her, and she had no idea why. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. And as she walked out of the hotel, she knew that the next chapter of this story was going to be even more shocking. Michelle stepped out of the Grand Horizon Hotel, the cool evening air hitting her face like a slap. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. She had always prided herself on being a fair and just owner, someone who treated her staff with respect and expected the same in return. But today, that trust had been shattered. Someone had set her up, and she was determined to find out who. As she walked to her car, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Michelle? What's up?" It was her best friend and business partner, Lisa. They had known each other since college, and Lisa was one of the few people Michelle trusted completely. "Lisa, I need your help," Michelle said, her voice tight with emotion. "Something just happened at the hotel, and it's bad." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What happened?" Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I was accused of theft. They thought I stole something from one of the guests." "What?" Lisa's voice was sharp with disbelief. "That's insane. Did you tell them who you are?" "I did," Michelle replied. "But that's not the worst part. Someone set me up. They knew who I was, and they wanted to embarrass me." There was another pause, longer this time. "Michelle, this is serious. Do you have any idea who it could be?" "No," Michelle admitted, "but I'm going to find out. I need you to come to the hotel. We need to go through everything. Security footage, employee records, everything. Someone in that hotel is behind this, and I'm not going to let them get away with it." "I'm on my way," Lisa said without hesitation. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Michelle ended the call and got into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She took a few deep breaths, trying to calm herself down. She needed to think clearly, to approach this situation with a level head. But it was hard. The humiliation of being accused of theft, the anger at being targeted because of her race, the betrayal of someone in her own hotel. It was all too much. As she drove back to the hotel, her mind kept going back to the young staff member who had warned her. Who was she? And why had she risked her job to tell Michelle the truth? Michelle made a mental note to find her as soon as she got back to the hotel. She needed to talk to her, to find out what she knew. When Michelle arrived at the hotel, Lisa was already waiting for her in the lobby. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked every bit the successful businesswoman she was, but there was a worried expression on her face as she approached Michelle. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, her blue eyes filled with concern. Michelle nodded, though she didn't feel okay at all. "I'm fine. Let's just get to the bottom of this." The two women made their way to the security office, where the head of security, a man named Greg, was waiting for them. Greg was a former police officer, and Michelle had always trusted him to keep the hotel safe. But today, she wasn't so sure. "Greg," Michelle said as they entered the office, "I need to see the security footage from the lobby earlier today." Greg nodded, his expression serious. "Of course, Miss Carter. I already pulled it up for you." He gestured to a monitor on the desk, and Michelle and Lisa leaned in to watch. The footage showed the lobby from several different angles, and Michelle quickly spotted herself walking in. She watched as she was approached by the security guard, then led to the office. Everything seemed normal at first, but then Michelle noticed something. "Wait," she said, pointing to the screen. "Who's that?" Greg paused the footage and zoomed in on a man standing near the front desk. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp suit. He was talking to one of the staff members, but Michelle didn't recognize him. "I don't know," Greg admitted. "I've never seen him before." Michelle's eyes narrowed. "Can you pull up the guest list? I want to know who he is." Greg quickly pulled up the guest list on his computer, but the man's name wasn't on it. Michelle's heart sank. If he wasn't a guest, then who was he? And what was he doing in her hotel? "This doesn't make sense," Lisa said, her voice tense. "If he's not a guest, how did he get in?" Michelle didn't have an answer. She turned to Greg. "I want you to go through all the footage from today. Find out who this guy is and what he was doing here. And I want to talk to the staff member he was talking to." Greg nodded. "I'll get right on it." As Greg started going through the footage, Michelle and Lisa left the security office and headed to the front desk. The staff member who had been talking to the mysterious man was a young woman named Emily. She looked nervous as Michelle and Lisa approached, but she tried to smile. "Emily," Michelle said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to ask you something." Emily nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Of course, Miss Carter. What is it?" "Earlier today, you were talking to a man near the front desk," Michelle said. "Do you remember him?" Emily's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. "Yes, I remember him. He was asking about the hotel security system. He said he was a consultant, and he wanted to make sure everything was up to date." Michelle exchanged a glance with Lisa. "A consultant? That didn't make any sense." Michelle hadn't hired any consultants, and she certainly hadn't authorized anyone to ask about the security system. "Did he show you any ID?" Michelle asked. Emily shook her head. "No, he didn't. But he seemed to know a lot about the hotel, so I didn't think anything of it." Michelle's mind was racing. This man had been asking about the security system, and now she had been accused of theft. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more going on? "Thank you, Emily," Michelle said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you see him again, let me know immediately." Emily nodded, still looking nervous. "Of course, Ms. Carter." As Michelle and Lisa walked away from the front desk, Lisa turned to Michelle, her expression grim. "This is bad, Michelle. If someone's messing with the security system, they could be planning something bigger." Michelle nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Lisa was right. This wasn't just about her being accused of theft. This was about someone trying to undermine her, to take control of her hotel. And she wasn't going to let that happen. But before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a text from Greg. "We found something. You need to see this." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She showed the text to Lisa, and the two women hurried back to the security office. When they arrived, Greg was waiting for them, his expression grave. "We found more footage of the man," he said, "and it's not good." He played the footage on the monitor, and Michelle and Lisa watched in horror as the man was seen tampering with one of the security cameras. He was quick and efficient, clearly knowing what he was doing. And then, just as he finished, he looked directly into the camera and smiled. It was a chilling sight, and Michelle felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Who is this guy?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Michelle didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear. This man was dangerous, and he was still in her hotel. "We need to find him," Michelle said, her voice firm. "Now." But before they could do anything, the lights in the security office flickered, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and Michelle's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Someone had cut the power, and they were still out there. The sudden darkness in the security office was suffocating. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. Lisa and Greg did the same, their faces pale and tense in the dim light. "What the hell just happened?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone cut the power," Greg said, his voice tight with anger. "This isn't an accident." Michelle's mind raced. The man who had tampered with the security cameras, was he behind this? Was he still in the hotel? She felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose control now. "Greg, do you have a backup generator?" Michelle asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Greg nodded. "Yes, but it'll take a few minutes to kick in. We should have power back soon." "Good," Michelle said. "In the meantime, we need to secure the hotel. Lisa, call the police. Tell them we have a potential intruder and that we need backup. Greg, gather your team and start sweeping the building. I want every room checked, every corner searched." "This guy isn't getting away." Greg hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Miss Carter. I'll get my team on it right away." As Greg left the room, Michelle turned to Lisa. "We need to find that staff member who warned me earlier. She might know more about what's going on." Lisa nodded, already dialing the police on her phone. "I'll make the call, then we'll find her." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The hotel was her responsibility, and she wasn't going to let some stranger, or worse, someone with a personal vendetta, destroy everything she had worked for. But as she stood there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. A few minutes later, the backup generator kicked in, and the lights flickered back on. Michelle let out a sigh of relief, but the tension in the room didn't ease. Greg's team was already moving through the hotel, checking every room and hallway. Lisa had finished her call to the police, and they were on their way. "Let's go," Michelle said, heading for the door. "We need to find that staff member." Lisa followed close behind, her phone still in hand. "Do you remember her name?" Michelle shook her head. "No, but I remember what she looked like. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair. She was working near the front desk." As they made their way through the lobby, Michelle scanned the faces of the staff members, looking for the young woman who had warned her. But she didn't see her. The lobby was in chaos, with guests milling about, confused and anxious about the sudden power outage. The staff was doing their best to keep everyone calm, but it was clear that the situation was getting out of hand. "Michelle," Lisa said, grabbing her arm. "Over there." Michelle turned to see the young woman standing near the elevators, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She was talking to one of the security guards, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke. Michelle and Lisa hurried over, and the young woman turned to them, her expression a mix of relief and panic. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so glad you're here. I think I know who the man is." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "Who is he?" The young woman hesitated, glancing around as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "His name is Daniel Harris. He used to work here, but he was fired a few months ago. He was always strange. He had a thing against you, Miss Carter. He used to say things, like you didn't deserve to own the hotel, that it should have been his." Michelle's eyes widened. Daniel Harris. The name rang a bell, but she couldn't quite place it. She turned to Lisa. Do you remember him? Lisa nodded, her face grim. Yeah, I remember. He was one of the managers. He got fired for harassing some of the staff. He was always causing trouble. Michelle's mind raced. If Daniel Harris was behind this, then this wasn't just about embarrassing her. This was personal. He had a grudge, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to get revenge. We need to find him, Michelle said, her voice firm. Now. But before they could do anything, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the lobby. Michelle turned to see one of the large windows near the entrance had been broken, and a man was climbing through it. It was Daniel Harris. He was dressed in black, his face twisted with anger as he stormed into the lobby. In his hand, he held a small device, a remote control of some kind. The guests screamed and scattered, and the security guards moved to intercept him, but he was too fast. The sound of sirens grew louder as police cars and fire trucks pulled up in front of the Grand Horizon Hotel. The guests and staff were already outside, gathered on the sidewalk, their faces pale with shock and fear. Michelle stood at the entrance, watching as the emergency responders rushed into the building. Her heart was still racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to be strong, for her staff, for her guests, and for herself. Lisa was by her side, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with the police. Yes, we've evacuated the building, she was saying, but we need bomb disposal units here immediately. The suspect claimed he planted explosives, and we have to assume he's telling the truth. Michelle's stomach churned at the thought. Explosives? In her hotel? The idea was unthinkable, but she couldn't afford to ignore it. Daniel Harris had proven himself to be dangerous, and she had no doubt he was capable of carrying out his threat. As the police began to secure the area, Michelle turned to Greg, who was standing nearby, his face grim. Greg, I need you to work with the police. Give them everything they need. Security footage, access to the building, anything. We have to find those explosives before it's too late. Greg nodded, his expression serious. Yes, Miss Carter. I'll make sure they have everything they need. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She knew she had to stay focused, but the weight of the situation was almost too much to bear. Her hotel, her father's legacy, was in danger, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility for everyone who had been affected by this nightmare. As she stood there, watching the chaos unfold, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Lisa, her face filled with concern. Michelle, Lisa said softly, you're doing everything you can, but you need to take a moment. You're in shock. Michelle shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. I can't, Lisa. Not yet. Not until I know everyone is safe. Lisa nodded, understanding. All right, but I'm here for you, okay? Whatever you need. Michelle gave her a small, grateful smile. Thank you. As the minutes ticked by, the police and bomb disposal units began their search of the hotel. Michelle watched from a safe distance, her heart pounding with every passing second. She felt helpless, standing there while others risked their lives to protect her hotel. But she knew there was nothing more she could do, except wait. And then, just as the tension was becoming unbearable, one of the police officers approached her. He was a tall man with a stern expression, but his eyes were kind. Miss Carter, he said, his voice calm but firm. We've found something. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. What is it? The officer hesitated for a moment, then said, We found a device in the basement. It's a bomb, and it's live. But don't worry, our bomb squad is handling it. They're working to disarm it now. Michelle felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. Is there anything I can do? The officer shook his head. Not right now. We've evacuated the area, and our team is doing everything they can. But I need you to stay back, for your own safety. Michelle nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to rush into the hotel and do something, anything, to help. But she knew the officer was right. She had to trust the professionals. As the officer walked away, Michelle turned to Lisa, her face pale. This is my fault, she whispered. If I had been more careful, if I had seen the signs. Stop, Lisa said firmly, cutting her off. This is not your fault, Michelle. You didn't do this. Daniel Harris did. He's the one to blame, not you. Michelle shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. But I should have known. I should have seen this coming. Lisa grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look into her eyes. Michelle, listen to me. You are not responsible for the actions of a madman. You've done everything you can to protect this hotel and the people in it. And right now, you need to stay strong. For them. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Lisa was right. She couldn't fall apart now. She had to be strong. For her staff, for her guests, and for herself. As the minutes turned into hours, the tension in the air grew thicker. The bomb squad was still working to disarm the device, and every second felt like an eternity. Michelle stood with Lisa, watching and waiting, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, finally, the police officer returned. His face was grim, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. Miss Carter, he said, the bomb has been disarmed. The hotel is safe. Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. The officer's expression was still serious, and she knew there was more. But, she asked, her voice trembling. The officer hesitated, then said, we found evidence that Daniel Harris wasn't working alone. There's someone else involved, someone who helped him plant the bomb. Michelle's heart sank. Someone else? Who could it be? And why would they want to hurt her hotel? Do you have any idea who it is? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer shook his head. Not yet, but we're working on it. We'll find them, Miss Carter. I promise. Michelle nodded, though her mind was racing. Someone had helped Daniel Harris. Someone who had access to the hotel, who knew its layout, who could move around without raising suspicion. It had to be someone on the inside. As the officer walked away, Michelle turned to Lisa, her face filled with determination. We need to find out who's behind this. Someone in this hotel betrayed us, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. Lisa nodded, her expression grim. I'm with you, Michelle. Whatever it takes. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The danger was far from over, but she was ready to face it. She had to protect her hotel, her staff, and her guests. And she wasn't going to stop until she found out who was responsible. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hotel was in lockdown. Police officers and bomb squad members moved through the halls, their faces tense as they continued their search for any additional threats. Michelle stood in the lobby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the chaos unfold. The bomb had been disarmed, but the danger wasn't over. Someone had helped Daniel Harris, and that person was still out there. Lisa was by her side, her phone buzzing constantly as she coordinated with the police and hotel staff. Michelle, she said, turning to her friend, the police want to interview the staff. They think someone on the inside might have helped Daniel. Michelle nodded, her jaw tight. I know, and I want to be there when they do. I need to know who betrayed us. Lisa hesitated, then said, Are you sure that's a good idea? You've been through a lot today. Maybe you should let the police handle this. Michelle shook her head, her eyes blazing with determination. No, this is my hotel, Lisa. My responsibility. I need to be part of this. Lisa sighed but didn't argue. She knew better than to try to talk Michelle out of something when she had her mind set. All right, but let's make sure the police are leading the interviews. We don't want to mess up their investigation. Michelle agreed, and the two women made their way to one of the conference rooms that had been set up as a temporary interview area. The room was filled with staff members, their faces pale and anxious as they waited to be questioned. Michelle scanned the room, her eyes lingering on each face, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. But everyone looked scared, and she couldn't blame them. They had just been through a traumatic experience, and now they were being treated as potential suspects. As the interviews began, Michelle sat in the corner of the room, listening carefully to each conversation. The police were thorough, asking each staff member about their whereabouts, their interactions with Daniel Harris, and whether they had noticed anything suspicious in the days leading up to the incident. Most of the answers were the same. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had any idea that Daniel was capable of something like this. But then, One interview caught Michelle's attention. The staff member being questioned was a young man named Jake, one of the hotel's maintenance workers. He was in his mid-20s, with short brown hair and a nervous demeanor. As the police questioned him, Michelle noticed that he was fidgeting, his eyes darting around the room as if he was looking for an escape. "Jake," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. "Can you tell us where you were this morning?" Jake hesitated, then said, "I was in the basement, working on the HVAC system. I didn't see anything." The officer nodded, but Michelle could tell he wasn't convinced. "And did you see anyone else down there? Anyone who shouldn't have been there?" Jake shook his head quickly. "No, no one. I was alone." Michelle's eyes narrowed. She knew the basement was where the bomb had been planted. If Jake had been down there, he might have seen something, or someone. The officer continued to question Jake, but his answers were evasive, and Michelle could tell he was hiding something. She exchanged a glance with Lisa, who nodded subtly. They both knew Jake was lying. When the interview was over, Michelle approached the officer. "I need to talk to Jake," she said, her voice firm. "Alone." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but be careful. We don't know what he's capable of." Michelle nodded and made her way over to Jake, who was sitting in a corner of the room, his head in his hands. She sat down across from him, her expression calm but serious. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I need you to tell me the truth. What happened in the basement?" Jake looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear. I don't know what you're talking about." Michelle leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Jake, I know you're lying. And I need you to understand something. This isn't just about you. Someone planted a bomb in my hotel. People could have died. If you know something, you need to tell me. Now." Jake's face crumpled, and he looked away, his hands trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he whispered. "I didn't know he was going to do something like this." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "Who, Jake? Who are you talking about?" Jake hesitated, then said, "Daniel. He came to me a few weeks ago. He said he needed my help with something. He offered me money, a lot of money. I didn't know what he was planning, I swear. He just said he needed access to the basement, and I gave him the keys." Michelle felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why, Jake? Why would you do that?" Jake's eyes filled with tears. "I was desperate. My mom's sick, and I needed the money to help her. I didn't think he was going to hurt anyone. I didn't know." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could see the guilt and fear in Jake's eyes, and she knew he was telling the truth. He had made a terrible mistake, but he wasn't the mastermind behind this. He was just a pawn in Daniel's game. "Jake," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "you need to tell the police everything. They need to know what Daniel did, and they need to know who else might be involved. Do you understand?" Jake nodded, his face pale. "Yes, I'll tell them everything." Michelle stood up and gestured for the police officer to come over. As she walked away, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. Jake had been manipulated, but his actions had put everyone in danger. And now, she had to deal with the fallout. As she rejoined Lisa, her friend looked at her with concern. "What happened?" Michelle sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Jake gave Daniel access to the basement. He didn't know what Daniel was planning, but he helped him. He's going to tell the police everything." Lisa's eyes widened. "Do you think there's anyone else involved?" Michelle shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to be prepared for anything." As the police continued their investigation, Michelle felt a sense of unease settle over her. The danger wasn't over. Daniel Harris had been working with someone, and that person was still out there. And until they were found, no one was safe. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, Michelle knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone destroy her hotel. She had fought too hard to build this place, and she wasn't going to let it fall apart now. The next chapter of this story was going to be even more dangerous, but Michelle was ready to face it. She had to be. The police had taken Jake into custody, and the hotel was slowly returning to a semblance of order. Guests were being allowed back into their rooms under strict supervision, and the staff was working tirelessly to clean up the mess and reassure everyone that the hotel was safe. But Michelle knew the real work was just beginning. Jake's confession had confirmed that Daniel Harris had helped, and that meant there was still a threat lurking in the shadows. Michelle and Lisa were in Michelle's office, going over the security footage from the past few weeks. The police had given them access to the recordings, and Michelle was determined to find any clue that might lead them to Daniel's accomplice. "This is going to take forever," Lisa said, rubbing her eyes as she stared at the screen. "There's so much footage to go through." Michelle nodded, her own eyes tired but focused. "I know, but we have to find something. Whoever helped Daniel is still out there, and we can't let them get away with this." As they scrolled through the footage, Michelle's mind kept going back to Jake. He had been manipulated, but he had also been desperate. Daniel had preyed on his vulnerability, and Michelle couldn't help but wonder if there were others like him. Staff members who might have been coerced or bribed into helping. "Lisa," Michelle said suddenly, pausing the footage. "We need to talk to the staff. Not just the ones who were interviewed earlier, but everyone. We need to find out if anyone else was approached by Daniel, or if they noticed anything suspicious." Lisa nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I'll get Greg to organize a meeting. We'll bring everyone together and see if anyone has information." As Lisa made the call, Michelle leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship, on knowing every inch of her hotel and every member of her staff. But now, she felt like she had been blindsided. How had she missed the signs? How had she not seen that someone in her own hotel was working against her? Before she could dwell on it too much, Lisa hung up the phone and turned to her. "Greg's gathering the staff in the ballroom. We'll have everyone there in about 15 minutes. Michelle nodded, standing up and smoothing out her suit. "Let's go." The ballroom was filled with staff members by the time Michelle and Lisa arrived. The room was buzzing with nervous energy, and Michelle could feel the tension in the air as she stepped up to the podium. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and then began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know today has been incredibly difficult for everyone, and I want to start by saying how proud I am of all of you. You've handled this situation with professionalism and courage, and I can't thank you enough for that." She paused, scanning the room. Every eye was on her, and she could see the fear and uncertainty in their faces. She knew she had to be careful with her words, but she also knew she had to be honest. "As you know, we've had a serious security breach today," she continued. "Daniel Harris, a former employee, was able to plant a bomb in the hotel with the help of someone on the inside. Thanks to the quick actions of our security team and the police, the bomb was disarmed and no one was hurt. But the threat isn't over. Daniel had help, and that person is still out there." There was a murmur of shock and fear from the staff, and Michelle held up a hand to quiet them. "I need your help," she said. "If anyone knows anything, if you were approached by Daniel, if you noticed anything unusual, if you have any information at all, I need you to come forward. This isn't about blame. This is about keeping everyone safe." The room was silent for a moment, and then a hand went up near the back. Michelle's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the young woman who had warned her earlier. "Emily." "Miss Carter," Emily said, her voice trembling. I think I might know something." Michelle nodded, her pulse quickening. "Go ahead, Emily." Emily took a deep breath, then said, "A few weeks ago, I saw Daniel talking to someone in the parking lot. It was late, and I was leaving after my shift. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the person he was talking to was wearing a hotel uniform." Michelle's eyes widened. "Did you recognize them?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it was too dark, and they were too far away. But I think they might have been a security guard." Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. A security guard? If Daniel had been working with someone on the security team, that would explain how he had been able to move around the hotel without being noticed. But who could it be? "Thank you, Emily," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "That's very helpful." As Emily sat down, Michelle turned to Greg, who was standing nearby. "Greg, I need you to pull the security footage from the parking lot for the past few weeks. We need to find out who Daniel was talking to." Greg nodded, his expression grim. "I'll get right on it." As the meeting continued, Michelle felt a mix of hope and dread. They were getting closer to finding Daniel's accomplice, but the thought that it might be someone on the security team was terrifying. These were the people who were supposed to protect the hotel, and now one of them might be a traitor. When the meeting was over, Michelle and Lisa returned to the office to continue going through the footage. Greg joined them a short while later, his face pale. "I found something," he said, his voice tense. "It's from the parking lot 2 weeks ago." Michelle and Lisa crowded around the monitor as Greg played the footage. The video was grainy, but they could clearly see Daniel standing near a car, talking to someone in a hotel uniform. The person's face was obscured by the shadows, but as they turned to leave, the light caught their badge. Michelle's heart stopped. The badge belonged to a security guard, one of Greg's own team. "Do you recognize them?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg nodded, his face filled with anger and disbelief. "Yeah, that's Ryan. He's been on my team for years." Michelle felt a surge of panic. Ryan was one of the most trusted members of the security team. If he was working with Daniel, then they were in even more danger than she had thought. "We need to find him," Michelle said, her voice firm. "Now." Greg nodded, already pulling out his radio. "I'll put out an alert. We'll find him." As Greg left the room, Michelle turned to Lisa, her face filled with determination. "We need to be ready for anything. If Ryan is involved, he's dangerous." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "I'll call the police. They need to know about this." As Lisa made the call, Michelle felt a sense of unease settle over her. They were closing in on Daniel's accomplice, but the danger was far from over. Ryan was still out there, and until they found him, no one was safe. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, Michelle knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone destroy her hotel. She had fought too hard to build this place, and she wasn't going to let it fall apart now. The next chapter of this story was going to be even more dangerous, but Michelle was ready to face it. She had to be. The hotel was on high alert. Greg had put out an all-points bulletin for Ryan, and the police were combing every inch of the building. Michelle stood in the security office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the monitors. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second felt like an eternity. "We'll find him," Greg said, his voice firm but tinged with worry. "He can't have gone far." Michelle nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. Ryan had been part of the security team for years. He knew the hotel inside and out, and if he was working with Daniel, he would know how to stay hidden. "Michelle," Lisa said, stepping into the room, "the police are setting up a perimeter around the hotel. They're going to do a room-by-room search." Michelle nodded, her eyes never leaving the monitors. "Good. We need to find him before he does something else." As the search continued, Michelle's mind raced. Ryan had been a trusted member of the team. How had she missed the signs? How had she not seen that he was capable of something like this? She felt a surge of guilt, but she forced herself to push it aside. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. She had to stay focused. And then, one of the monitors caught her eye. It was a feed from the basement, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement. She leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Greg," she said, her voice tense. "Look at this." Greg hurried over, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the screen. "What is that?" Michelle pointed to the corner of the screen, where a shadow seemed to shift. "There. Do you see it?" Greg nodded, his face grim. "Yeah, someone's down there." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "Ryan?" "Could be," Greg said, already reaching for his radio. "I'll send a team down there." Michelle shook her head. "No, I'm going with you." Greg hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but stay close." Michelle and Greg made their way to the basement, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air was cold and damp, and the dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls. Michelle's heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to be strong. As they reached the basement door, Greg paused, his hand on his weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low. Michelle nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Greg pushed the door open slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs overhead. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. "Ryan," Greg called out, his voice firm. "Are you down here?" There was no response, but Michelle thought she heard a faint shuffling sound. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. "Spread out," Greg said, gesturing to the other security guards who had followed them. "But be careful." Michelle stayed close to Greg as they moved through the basement, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tension was almost unbearable, and every shadow seemed to move as they passed. Michelle's heart was racing, and she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. And then she saw it, a flash of movement near the far wall. She grabbed Greg's arm, her eyes wide. "There." Greg turned, his weapon raised. "Ryan, come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Ryan, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice trembling. "Please." Greg kept his weapon trained on Ryan, his expression grim. "Hands where I can see them." Ryan raised his hands slowly, his eyes darting around the room. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what Daniel was planning. I swear." Michelle stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "You helped him plant a bomb in my hotel, Ryan. People could have died." Ryan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. He said it was just a scare tactic, that he just wanted to scare you. I didn't know he was going to do something like this." Michelle felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why, Ryan? Why would you do this?" Ryan hesitated, then said, He had something on me, something from my past. He said he'd expose me if I didn't help him." Michelle's heart sank. Ryan had been blackmailed, just like Jake. Daniel had preyed on their vulnerabilities, using them to carry out his plan. But that didn't excuse what Ryan had done. "You should have come to me," Michelle said, her voice firm. "I could have helped you." Ryan shook his head, his face filled with regret. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Greg stepped forward, his expression grim. "Ryan, you're under arrest. You need to come with us." Ryan nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand." As Greg and the other security guards led Ryan away, Michelle felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. Ryan had been part of her team, someone she had trusted, and now he had betrayed her. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone destroy her hotel. She had fought too hard to build this place, and she wasn't going to let it fall apart now. The next chapter of this story was going to be even more dangerous, but Michelle was ready to face it. She had to be. The arrest of Ryan sent shockwaves through the hotel. The staff was reeling, and the guests were on edge. Michelle knew she had to address the situation head-on, but she also knew that the danger wasn't over. Daniel Harris was still out there, and until he was caught, no one was safe. Michelle stood in the lobby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the police escort Ryan out of the building. His face was pale, his eyes filled with regret, but Michelle felt no sympathy for him. He had betrayed her trust, and he had put everyone in danger. She couldn't forgive that. As the police car pulled away, Lisa approached her, her face filled with concern. "Michelle, we need to talk." Michelle nodded, her mind still racing. "What is it?" Lisa hesitated, then said, "The police found something in Ryan's locker. A phone. They think it might have been used to communicate with Daniel." Michelle's eyes widened. "Did they find anything on it?" Lisa nodded. "They're going through it now, but they think there might be evidence that could lead us to Daniel." Michelle felt a surge of hope. If they could find Daniel, they could end this nightmare once and for all. "We need to see that phone." Lisa nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I'll call the police and see if they can bring it over." As Lisa made the call, Michelle turned to Greg, who was standing nearby. "Greg, I need you to tighten security. I don't want anyone getting in or out of this hotel without being checked." Greg nodded, his expression serious. "I'll make sure of it." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The hotel was in chaos, but she had to stay focused. She had to protect her staff, her guests, and her hotel. As the minutes ticked by, the police arrived with Ryan's phone. Michelle and Lisa met them in the security office, where the officers were already going through the device. "We found some messages," one of the officers said, his voice tense. "It looks like Ryan and Daniel were in contact regularly. They were planning something big." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of something?" The officer hesitated, then said, "It's hard to say for sure, but it looks like they were planning another attack. And it's going to happen soon." Michelle felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Do you have any idea where Daniel is?" The officer shook his head. "Not yet, but we're working on it. We're tracking his phone, and we're going through all the security footage to see if we can find him." Michelle nodded, her mind racing. They were running out of time. If Daniel was planning another attack, they had to stop him before it was too late. As the police continued their work, Michelle turned to Lisa. "We need to warn the staff and the guests. We need to be ready for anything." Lisa nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I'll send out an alert." As Lisa made the call, Michelle felt a sense of unease settle over her. The danger was far from over, and she knew that the next few hours were going to be critical. She had to stay strong, for her staff, for her guests, and for herself. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hotel was on edge. The staff had been briefed, the guests had been warned, and the police were stationed at every entrance and exit. Michelle stood in the security office, her eyes glued to the monitors as she watched the footage from the cameras. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second felt like an eternity. "We'll find him," Greg said, his voice firm but tinged with worry. "He can't have gone far." Michelle nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. Daniel Harris was still out there, and until he was caught, no one was safe. As the search continued, Michelle's mind raced. Daniel had been one step ahead of them this whole time. He had manipulated Jake and Ryan, and he had planted a bomb in her hotel. What else was he capable of? And what was his endgame? "Michelle," Lisa said, stepping into the room. "The police found something." Michelle turned to her, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" Lisa hesitated, then said, "They found a van parked a few blocks away. It's registered to Daniel Harris." Michelle's eyes widened. "Did they find him?" Lisa shook her head. "No, but they're searching the area now. They think he might be close." Michelle felt a surge of hope. If they could find Daniel, they could end this nightmare once and for all. "We need to be ready for anything." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "I'll make sure the staff is on high alert." As Lisa left the room, Michelle turned back to the monitors. Her eyes scanned the footage, searching for any sign of Daniel. But the hotel was a maze of hallways and rooms, and he could be anywhere. And then, one of the monitors caught her eye. It was a feed from the kitchen, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement. She leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Greg," she said, her voice tense. "Look at this." Greg hurried over, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the screen. "What is that?" Michelle pointed to the corner of the screen, where a shadow seemed to shift. "There. Do you see it?" Greg nodded, his face grim. "Yeah. Someone's in the kitchen." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "Daniel?" "Could be," Greg said, already reaching for his radio. "I'll send a team down there." Michelle shook her head. "No, I'm going with you." Greg hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but stay close." Michelle and Greg made their way to the kitchen, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to move as they passed. Michelle's heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to be strong. As they reached the kitchen door, Greg paused, his hand on his weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low. Michelle nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Greg pushed the door open slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign. The air was thick with the smell of food and cleaning supplies, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. "Daniel?" Greg called out, his voice firm. Are you in here? There was no response, but Michelle thought she heard a faint shuffling sound. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. Spread out, Greg said, gesturing to the other security guards who had followed them. But be careful. Michelle stayed close to Greg as they moved through the kitchen, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tension was almost unbearable, and every shadow seemed to move as they passed. Michelle's heart was racing, and she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. And then, she saw it, a flash of movement near the walk-in freezer. She grabbed Greg's arm, her eyes wide. There. Greg turned, his weapon raised. Daniel, come out with your hands up. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the door to the freezer creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It was Daniel Harris, his face pale and his eyes filled with rage. You think you've won? He snarled, his voice trembling with anger. You think you can stop me? Michelle felt a surge of fear, but she forced herself to stay calm. Daniel, it's over. You need to surrender. Daniel shook his head, his eyes blazing with hatred. No, this isn't over. Not until I've destroyed everything you've built. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Daniel smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Michelle's spine. You'll see. And then, before anyone could react, Daniel pulled something from his pocket, a small, black device with a blinking red light. Michelle's eyes widened in horror. Greg, get down. But it was too late. Daniel pressed the button, and the device beeped once, twice, and then the explosion rocked the kitchen, sending debris flying in every direction. Michelle was thrown to the ground, her ears ringing and her vision blurred. She could hear screams and shouts, but they sounded distant, like they were coming from another world. As she struggled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest, she saw the devastation around her. The kitchen was in ruins, the walls blackened and the equipment destroyed. Greg was lying on the ground, his face pale and his eyes closed. Michelle's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to his side. Greg, she cried, shaking him gently. Greg, wake up. But Greg didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, and his face was covered in blood. Michelle felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to get help. As she reached for her radio, she heard a faint groan from across the room. She turned to see Daniel lying on the ground, his body twisted and broken. He was still alive, but barely. Michelle felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a deep sense of sadness. Daniel had caused so much pain, so much destruction, and now he was paying the price. But as she stood there, surrounded by the chaos, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone destroy her hotel. She had fought too hard to build this place, and she wasn't going to let it fall apart now. The next chapter of this story was going to be even more dangerous, but Michelle was ready to face it. She had to be. The aftermath of the explosion was chaos. The kitchen was in ruins, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning debris. Michelle's ears were still ringing, and her vision was blurred, but she forced herself to stay focused. Greg was unconscious, and Daniel was barely alive. She had to act quickly. Help, Michelle shouted, her voice hoarse from the smoke. We need help in here. Security guards and staff members rushed into the kitchen, their faces pale with shock. Michelle pointed to Greg, who was still lying on the ground. Get him out of here. He needs medical attention. Two of the guards hurried over and carefully lifted Greg, carrying him out of the kitchen. Michelle turned to Daniel, who was groaning in pain. His face was covered in blood, and his body was twisted at an unnatural angle. Despite everything he had done, Michelle felt a pang of pity for him. Daniel, she said, kneeling beside him. Why? Why did you do this? Daniel coughed, blood spilling from his lips. You took everything from me, he rasped, his voice barely audible. This hotel, it should have been mine. Michelle shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. It was never about the hotel, Daniel. It was about your choices. You could have been better, but you chose this. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Michelle thought she saw a flicker of regret. But then his body went still, and his eyes closed. He was gone. Michelle felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. Daniel had caused so much pain, but in the end, he had been a broken man. She couldn't hate him, but she couldn't forgive him either. As she stood up, Lisa rushed into the kitchen, her face pale with fear. "Michelle, are you okay?" Michelle nodded, though her body ached and her mind was still reeling. "I'm fine, but Greg, he's hurt. And Daniel, he's dead." Lisa's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly composed herself. "The police and paramedics are here. They're taking care of everything." Michelle nodded, her mind racing. The hotel was in shambles, but they had survived. They had stopped Daniel, and now they could begin to rebuild. As the paramedics arrived and began tending to the injured, Michelle and Lisa stepped outside. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the city. The hotel stood tall and proud, a symbol of resilience and strength. "We made it," Lisa said, her voice filled with relief. "It's over." Michelle nodded, but her mind was already turning to the future. "It's not over," she said. "Not yet. We have a lot of work to do. We need to rebuild, to make sure this never happens again." Lisa smiled, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll do it together, just like we always have." Michelle felt a surge of gratitude for her friend. Lisa had been by her side through everything, and she knew she couldn't have done this without her. As they stood there, watching the sunrise, Michelle felt a sense of hope. The hotel was more than just a building. It was a symbol of her father's legacy, of her own hard work and determination, and she wasn't going to let anyone destroy it. The next chapter of their story was going to be challenging, but Michelle was ready to face it. She had to be. Life, much like the story of Michelle and the Grand Horizon Hotel, is filled with unexpected challenges and moments that test our strength, resilience, and faith. Michelle faced betrayal, danger, and loss, but she never gave up. She stood tall, fought for what she believed in, and rebuilt what was broken. Her story reminds us that no matter how dark the storm, the sun will rise again. No matter what you're going through, don't give up. Keep fighting, keep believing, and keep moving forward. Your resilience will inspire others, and your strength will carry you through. Remember, the hardest battles often lead to the most beautiful victories. You've got this. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions about this shocking story in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get notified whenever there's a new video. It will help us bring you more impactful content. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.